Hi everyone, it's Lisa from IDreaminSoap. Now I've always loved the look of the tall and skinny soap bars, and I've wanted a tall and skinny soap mould for quite a while. The problem with being in the UK is that none of our suppliers seem to sell them. Now I've looked on eBay and there are a few on there, but to be honest they're not really the sort of shape that I actually want. And if I try and buy one from Etsy or maybe import one from the US, I'm looking at paying over £100 to get my soap mould, and that's just not something I'm willing to do at the moment. So I already have a whole bunch of silicone, and we've always got some bits and pieces of wood kicking around in our garage. So I've made my own tall and skinny silicone mould and my tall and skinny wooden soap mould. Now I showed my efforts to my other half and he called it a Robinson Crusoe mould, and I said to him, what on earth do you mean by that? And he said, it looks like you've made that out of bits and pieces of wood washed up after a shipwreck. Oh well, it was scraps of wood that we had kicking around the garage, and anyway, hey, didn't cost me any extra money. Come on, let's go make some soap. For this soap I'm going to be doing a solid base layer with a textured top, and then on top of that I'm going to do a drop swirl, but I'm aiming to get the drops nice and small rather than a large sort of type of drop swirl. So I've split off 30% of my oils and 30% of my lye. Typically I soak between 80 and 90 degrees. And I find that works well for me because it gives me enough time to work with my batter, and also the temperature's high enough so I avoid getting any steric spots. Now I don't have one of those fancy laser thermometers, and I actually quite like just using my thermometers that I stick into the oils and the lye. I have two separate thermometers so I'm not sort of mixing from one to the other. I find they work really well, and I like using those because then they actually test the temperature of your oil and your lye all the way through it, rather than a laser thermometer just literally tests the surface area. As normal, I use my pre-made up colour swatches to help me choose my colours, and you can see here I'm using 4 colours: Purple Heart from You Make It Up, Red Riot from Mica Mama, and Lime from You Make It Up, and also I'm going to be using some titanium dioxide. So nothing too revolutionary going on here, I'm just literally mixing up my oils and my lye together for this smaller base layer. Just doing the normal sort of things really. I'm going to blend it, a combination of hand blending and stick blending, until I bring it up to a light trace. Then I'm going to add in my colouring and my fragrance oil, and then just pour it into the mould. Now the fragrance I'm using is called Black Plum and Rhubarb, and it comes from Candle Shack in the UK. It's a really fruity fragrance, and it's actually quite strong and holds really well in cold processed soap. It's also great because it doesn't accelerate either. Now normally I don't stick blend my fragrances in, but I'm just literally going for a solid bottom layer that I actually want to set up fairly quickly, so therefore I'm giving this a bit more of a stick blend so that I can get a bit of a thicker trace before I pour it into the mould. Now even though this is going to be a solid layer that's poured in, I'm going to have a textured top, I still don't want my trace to be too thick. I don't want to be blopping it into the mould. So therefore, as you can see, mine is still really very pourable. And the reason I keep it at this texture is, yeah, it might take a little bit longer to set up, but it does mean that as I pour it in, I'm definitely not going to get any problems with any air bubbles where the thick batter, hasn't actually got banged down properly. So I let that layer set up. It probably took about 40 minutes to get to a decent sort of consistency, and now I'm just going through with a palette knife and texturing the surface. And then I'm just going through with a little spatula and just making sure that there's no splodges of the green on the side of the mould, because if any of that is left up there, it will then just appear on the side of the bars as you cut them. So now we're moving on to the top part of my soap. So here I've got the other 70% of my oils and my lye, so no surprise there. And I'm just going to pour the lye into the oils, and then I want to weigh the whole lot together because I want to divide everything out evenly. So I'm going to do that before I start mixing everything up, so I'm not giving the lye much time to react with most of the oils. Now I do know all the weight of all of my soaping containers. I actually have it sort of engraved onto the side of them, but do remember if you're doing this to take your soaping container weight off before you work out how to split your oils and lye up. And now is the point I'm going to bring the rest of the batch up to emulsion. Now I have made sure that I'm soaping at the lower of my temperature ranges, around about sort of 80 degrees here, because it's really important. I want this to be at a thin trace, but I don't want it to accelerate really past there. So just as I normally do, a combination of stick blending and a lot of stirring to get to the consistency that I want. And then when I'm completely happy that I've definitely got emulsion with my batter, I'm going to split my batch up, and I'll do it at this stage. I don't wait to get trace at this point, because remember I'm still going to muck around. I've still got to do some time splitting things out, and then I've got to put in my colouring, and I've got to put in my fragrance oil, and all of that takes time. So I tend to split at emulsion, and then I can always bring the batter on a little bit later if I want to get to any sort of thicker trace. I've already dispersed all of my colours in some olive oil, and I always do this. I find it stops you getting those little speckles in your soap, and also when you're after a light trace you want to do as little stick blending as possible. So now at this stage I can just mix them in with a spatula rather than having to go back to my stick blender to try and get the colours blended in. And then with my colours mix, it's time to add my fragrance oil, the same fragrance oil as I used for the base, that black plum and rhubarb. I do tend to measure my fragrance oil out so I can split it accurately. It's not massively important. As long as you're there or thereabouts, then that's absolutely fine. So now I'm just waiting for the batter to get to the light trace that I want, because I split them at emulsion and they're still sort of just emulsified. They haven't really got a trace. You could at this stage, if you wanted to, stick a stick blender in. I prefer not to, I'll go away, do a little bit of washing up or something and just stir them every now and again, and that way you can really control that point where you get to the perfect amount of trace that you want. And because you haven't agitated them with a stick blender, everything seems to stay that little bit slower. Okay, so as you can see, I'm just mucking around here, just keeping an eye on things, and as soon as I get to the trace that I want, I'm going to start my pour. Okay, so now I've got to the trace that I want. I'm going to start my main pour. Now, my base is set up really well, so I'm really confident that the batter's not going to go through into the lower part of the soap, so there's no need to use a spatula or anything. And to be honest, you wouldn't want to do that with this technique anyway. It just wouldn't work with doing this sort of drop swirl. Now, what I'm trying to aim for with this drop swirl is sort of like a mini droplets as such. I don't want a big drop swirl, you know, with like a couple of big loops going through the soap. I want lots and lots of little drops. So therefore, these thin spouted jugs are really great to get a good stream of soap. And I'm just going to alternate reasonably quickly, just doing lots and lots of passes and changing my jugs until I've used up all of my batter. It's important to make sure that you keep your batter nice and fluid. Couple of reasons. One, it needs to pour nicely, and also the second reason is, remember, this is a drop swirl, so you do want the layer that you're pouring in to actually sink into the batter below slightly. So you do want to keep it as fluid as possible. So every now and again, just make sure the batter in the jugs, you give them a good stir up before you go and pour them. Now, I don't know how well you can see them, but I've got two little bits of sticky tape halfway down my mould, just holding the silicone to the edge of the mould because it tends to flop in a little bit. And these are starting to really annoy me at this stage because they just keep getting in the way of my pour, and I keep getting some batter on the top of them, and they're just starting to wind me up a little bit. So what I actually do is as soon as the soap's got up a little bit higher, I then peel them off because the batter inside the mould is going to hold that mould out nicely. If you hang around till the end, then you'll see that I worked out a solution for this little floppy mould problem. And then just to finish off the top, I'm just pouring in the last little bits and pieces of each of the colours in straight lines, and then I'm just going to use that to do a swirl to finish everything off. So there we are, everything finished off, and a nice close-up there of the Robinson Crusoe mould. So now I will spray lightly with rubbing alcohol. I will cover this and I will pop in the oven to pop it. I think that wood's going to be pretty insulating, so I think it's going to go through gel anyway. I pop it in the oven at 75 degrees, turn the oven off as soon as I put it in there, and I leave it to sit overnight. Oh, I nearly forgot, so I'll just pop this in here. Remember the floppy old mould situation? I made myself some little clips out of some plastic, and these just clip nicely on the side. No more floppy mould. So I then cut the loaf about 24 hours later. Nothing complicated or anything going on with the cut, so I'll just leave you in peace so you can have a look at the bars as they come out. And then finally some pictures of the finished soap. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you like the soap. If you do, please leave me a thumbs up. If you've got any comments and queries, please leave them in the comments section below. And if you'd like to see what I'm doing in the future, why not subscribe to my channel? Thanks for watching everyone. Happy soaping!